The dog came in first. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. Not in the hallways, not in the debrief, not in the carefully worded letter that human resources slid under Marin Kowalczuk's locker door 3 days later. Everyone remembered the soldiers, the shouting. The way Administrator Holt's face went the color of old brick when the doors opened. But the dog came in first, and that was where everything actually started. It was 11:15 on a Tuesday night, which meant Marin was technically 47 minutes into overtime she hadn't asked for and wouldn't be paid for. The Trillium Regional ER in Sudbury was the kind of hospital that always needed one more person on shift, the kind that sent apologetic emails about staffing shortages and then scheduled you for back-to-back 12s anyway. She'd been there 6 years. She knew how it worked. She'd done a tour with the Canadian Forces before nursing school. 2 years as a medical technician. One deployment to a forward operating base in a country she still couldn't talk about at dinner parties without her mother changing the subject. She'd learned to triage in conditions that made Trillium Regional look like a spa. She'd learned that the first 30 seconds with a patient told you almost everything you needed to know if you paid attention. She paid attention. The man who came through the ER doors at 11:17 p.m. was large, controlled, and bleeding from a laceration on his left forearm that he was ignoring completely. He was wearing civilian clothes, but carrying himself the way only certain people do. Spine straight, eyes moving in practiced arcs, the kind of stillness that isn't stillness at all but readiness. In his arms was a Belgian Malinois, roughly 30 kilograms, with a field dressing wrapped tight around its right hind quarter. The dressing was soaked through. The dog was conscious but going quiet in the wrong way. That particular kind of quiet that Marin recognized from the fob. The way things got quiet right before they stopped. She was already moving toward him before the triage desk nurse, Fowler, had looked up from her screen. "How long?" Marin asked. The man looked at her. His eyes were dark and very steady. "Hour and 20. She pulled on gloves from the dispenser at the wall. "What happened?" "Training exercise. Fencing gave. He went through before I could stop him." His voice was flat, professional. "Femoral area. Pressure's holding, but it keeps giving." Marin crouched and lifted the edge of the field dressing with 2 fingers, just enough. The wound was deep, ragged. Not the clean slice of surgical steel, but the tearing of metal wire under force. The muscle was exposed. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. A femoral adjacent laceration on a dog this size, this kind of blood loss over this amount of time. She stood. "Bay 3. Come with me," Fowler said. "Marin." She heard the tone. She kept walking. "Marin," louder. "You can't bring that animal into." "He's coming into Bay 3, she said, without turning around. "Get me a bag of saline and a surgical tray. The general one, not the cardiac." She heard Fowler pick up the phone. Bay 3 was at the end of the corridor, half-curtained, smelling of antiseptic and the particular recycled air staleness of a hospital at night. Marin directed the man to the gurney, not for himself, but to lay the dog across it, and he did it without question, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned a long time ago to follow competent instructions quickly. She was checking the wound properly, counting her own breathing when she heard the footsteps. Administrator Holt did not walk into rooms. He arrived in them. He was a tall man, late 50s, with the particular confidence of someone who had spent 30 years being deferred to. And he wore it like a second suit jacket, pressed, immovable, slightly too warm for the season. Kowalczuk. She didn't look up. Give me a minute. I'll give you about 10 seconds to explain what you think you're doing." The man with the dog said nothing. He stood at the head of the gurney with his hand on the animal's neck, and his eyes tracked Holt with a quality of attention that Holt, to his significant disadvantage, did not notice. "There's a femoral adjacent laceration that needs to be closed," Marin said. She was palpating the wound edges, estimating depth. "The animal has been in controlled blood loss for over an hour and 15. If it goes another 30 minutes without intervention, it will likely go into shock. This is a human medical facility." "I'm aware of that. We don't treat animals, Kowalchuk. This isn't a... I know what it isn't." She finally looked up. "Fowler, did you get that saline?" Fowler was standing in the doorway with the tray. Her expression, the particular combination of sympathy and self-preservation that Marin had seen on good people in bad institutional situations her entire career. She looked at Holt. She looked at Marin. Marin held out her hand. Holt stepped forward and put himself between Marin and Fowler, not touching her, but close enough that the intention was clear. "If you proceed with this," he said, "I will suspend you pending a full review. I want to be very clear about that." Marin looked at him for a moment. She thought about the fob. She thought about a corporal named Des Roche, who'd lost 2 fingers because they'd waited 12 minutes too long for clearance to proceed. She thought about the dog on the gurney going quiet in the wrong way. "Then suspend me," she said, "but step aside first." Holt didn't step aside. He turned to the man standing at the head of the gurney, apparently expecting, what exactly? An apology, a de-escalation, someone to tell the stubborn nurse to stand down. The man looked back at him without expression. "Sir," Holt said, "I understand this is a difficult situation, but our liability and our facility protocols..." "She's going to help him," the man said. It wasn't a request. The silence in Bay 3 had a particular texture. Holt seemed to recognize, for the first time, something about the quality of attention in the room. He looked at the man's hands. He looked at the way the man was standing. He took one step back. Not enough, but one step. Marin went to work. She'd assisted in veterinary procedures exactly once, during a disaster relief rotation, where the distinction between human and animal triage had become largely academic. She knew enough. She knew the anatomy was different and the same in all the ways that mattered. She cleaned the wound, irrigated with saline, assessed the muscle damage. The bleeding was manageable. The wound needed to be closed properly, and she had the tools to do it, and so she did. The man stayed at the dog's head the entire time, talking to the animal in a low, continuous murmur. Not words. Exactly, just sound. The kind of reassurance that bypassed language entirely. The dog's breathing slowed and steadied. Its eyes stayed on the man's face. Marin worked without hurrying and without stopping, the way she'd learned to work when the margin for error was not a margin at all, but a line. 40 minutes later, the wound was closed. The animal was stable, and Marin stripped off her gloves with the particular exhaustion of concentrated effort. The man looked at her. She looked at him. "He's going to need proper veterinary care within the next 12 hours, she said. "The closure will hold, but it needs to be assessed by someone who can do imaging. There may be deeper muscle involvement." "Understood." He paused. "Thank you." Holt was no longer in the doorway. He found her at the nursing station 20 minutes later, which was how long it had taken him to compose himself into the version of administrative authority that he preferred. He had a printed form in his hand which was new. Usually the suspension conversations happened verbally, with the paperwork following. The form was a statement of intent to suspend pending disciplinary review. He set it on the counter in front of her. "You'll need to sign acknowledging receipt." Marin looked at the form. She'd been a forces medic. She'd been a floor nurse at 2 other hospitals before Trillium. She'd been through one disciplinary review years ago for a different kind of disagreement with a different kind of administrator. She knew the forms. She knew what they meant and what they didn't mean. She picked up the pen. She signed. Then she sat down in the chair behind the nursing station. Because she'd been on her feet for 14 hours, and she was going to be on her feet for several more, and her body had opinions about that, regardless of whatever else was happening. Holt took the form and left. Fowler appeared next to her with a coffee. She didn't say anything. She just set it down. Marin wrapped her hands around it and stared at the wall. The night continued. She was still technically on shift. The suspension was pending review, not immediate. And there were patients who needed her, so she kept working, because that was what she did. There was a kid with a broken wrist from a skateboarding fall. There was an elderly man with chest pain that turned out to be muscular, not cardiac, which was the best possible outcome and the one she'd suspected from the doorway. There was a young woman with an allergic reaction, mild, easily managed, the ordinary catastrophes of a Tuesday night ER. She was writing up the allergy case at 1:30 a.m. when Fowler came to find her. Fowler's expression was different. It was the expression of someone who had just seen something they were still processing. "There are people here," Fowler said. Marin looked up. "In the waiting area." Fowler paused. "A lot of them." Marin followed her. The waiting room of Trillium Regional EGR held, at capacity, perhaps 30 people. There were significantly more than 30 people in it now. They were arranged with a kind of unconscious order that Moran recognized before she understood why she recognized it. A loose perimeter. Positions that allowed sight lines in multiple directions, a central figure toward whom the others were oriented without being obvious about it. All of them in civilian clothes. All of them carrying themselves the same way the man with the dog had carried himself. At the front, standing with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the triage desk, was a man in his late 40s with the particular bearing of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any given room. He was clean-cut, not large but composed in a way that took up more space than his physical dimensions suggested. Next to him stood the man from Bay 3, cleaned up now, the laceration on his arm properly wrapped, his dog nowhere visible, which meant someone was with it. Marin walked toward them. The man at the front looked at her. He looked at her name badge, then back at her face. "Kowalchuk," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Warrant Officer Renault." He said it without the title needing explanation. "My team, and our unit's veterinary officer, who is currently with Kodiak in your Bay 3, if that's all right with you." "That's fine," Marin said. "Sergeant Haverford tells me you closed a grade 3 muscle laceration under suboptimal conditions at approximately 2330 hours tonight." "Yes." Renault studied her for a moment, with the same quality of attention Haverford had used on Holt, except more concentrated. "He also tells me that the administrator of this facility attempted to prevent that treatment and suspended you for proceeding." Marin said nothing. "I'd like to speak with that administrator." "It's 1:30 in the morning," she said. "He went home." Something moved in Renault's expression. Not anger, exactly, more like the particular focus of someone updating a threat assessment. "I see." He paused. "We'll be back at 0800 then." "You don't need to do that." "No." Renault agreed. We don't need to. She understood the distinction. Behind Renault, his team stood in the waiting room of Trillium Regional, with the patient stillness of people who had waited in far worse places for far longer. A few of them had gotten coffee from the vending machine. One of them was filling out a crossword from a magazine he'd found on a chair. They looked, at a casual glance, like a large group of physically impressive civilians waiting for news about a family member. At a less casual glance, they looked like exactly what they were. Fowler appeared at Marin's elbow. Should I call Dr. Champagne? He's the on-call senior physician. He'd probably want to. Let him sleep, Marin said. I'll brief him in the morning. She went back to the nursing station. She finished the allergy case right up. She started the documentation on Kodiak. She wrote it as an emergency procedure, performed on a certified working animal under exceptional circumstances, which was accurate. She cross-referenced the relevant sections of the Canadian Forces Service Animal Regulations, which Fowler found for her in 20 minutes of fast searching. There was more there than Holt had apparently known about. There generally was. At 3:15 a.m., the veterinary officer from Renault's unit came to find her. He was young, mid-20s, earnest, with the kind of thoroughness in his manner that good military medical personnel shared across disciplines. His name tag said Arbor. The wound closure is solid, Arbor said. He sounded genuinely impressed. You used an interrupted horizontal mattress pattern. It holds better under movement stress. Yes, that's exactly right. He paused. Where did you learn that, Kandahar? She said. Arbor looked at her for a moment. You were out there. Medical tech, before nursing school. He nodded slowly. The way veterans recognized veterans. Not in words, but in a kind of quiet recalibration of who the other person was. Kodiak's going to be fine, he said. The muscle involvement is minimal. He'll be back on operational status in 6 to 8 weeks. He paused. That's because of what you did tonight. Marin said nothing. She finished writing. The shift ended at 7 a.m. She should have left at midnight. She was too tired to do the math on how many hours that actually was. She signed out, changed into her street clothes, and was pulling on her coat in the locker room when Fowler knocked on the doorframe. He's here, Fowler said. She didn't need to ask who. Holt arrived at 7:45, which was slightly before 0800, and therefore either coincidence or an attempt to get ahead of something. He was wearing his good suit. He had his assistant with him, which he did when he anticipated a situation requiring witnesses in his favor. Renault was already in the lobby. He was alone, which was more unsettling than if he'd brought the team. Marin stood to the side, near the windows that looked out on the parking lot, where she could see the rest of the unit arranged with casual patience near a row of vehicles. She had her coffee. She watched. She couldn't hear the conversation from where she stood. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough of those conversations to read them by posture and proximity alone. Holt opened with something that was clearly an administrative deflection. She could tell by the way his hands came up, the way he shifted his weight toward his assistant. Renault listened without expression. When Holt finished, Renault said something short. Holt's hands came down. His weight shifted back. Renault said something else. He reached into his jacket, not fast, but with the complete economy of movement of someone for whom threat and non-threat were decisions made well in advance of the action, and produced a card which he handed to Holt. Holt looked at it. He looked at Renault. He looked at the card again. Whatever was on it, it was sufficient. Holt's assistant left the lobby 15 minutes later to make phone calls. Holt himself sat down in one of the waiting room chairs, which Marin had genuinely never seen him do before, and appeared to be examining something on the middle distance that wasn't quite there. Renaud walked over to where Marin was standing. "The suspension review will be expedited," he said. "I've been informed it will conclude by end of week. I've also been told the documentation of the procedure you performed will be reviewed by the hospital's legal counsel in the context of the service animal regulations and the applicable duty of care considerations." He paused. "I'm not a lawyer, neither am I, but I've been told the outcome is likely to be favorable to you." Marin looked out the window at the parking lot. The morning had come in gray and cold, the way Sudbury mornings did in March. The kind of cold that wasn't seasonal anymore, but had become the baseline. She could see Haverford in the parking lot, crouched next to one of the vehicles, with Kodiak on a low platform beside him. The dog was bandaged cleanly, alert, watching Haverford's face, with the complete trust of an animal that knew who it belonged to. "How long has he been with you?" she asked. 4 years, Renaud said. "He's the best working dog I've ever seen." She nodded. "Kowalchuk." Renaud's voice changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but less operational, more direct. "What you did last night was the right thing. Whatever they decide in the review, whatever the documentation says, the right thing was the right thing. You know that." She did know that. She'd known it at 11:17 p.m., when the dog came through the door, going quiet in the wrong way. And she'd known it when she'd signed the suspension form. And she knew it now. It hadn't been a complicated decision, actually. It had just been a decision that cost something. Most right things did. Tell Haverford he should have that laceration on his arm properly assessed, she said. He's been ignoring it. The corner of Renaud's mouth moved. "I'll tell him you said so." "Tell him I said so specifically. He'll listen better if it came from someone who's going to check." Renaud looked at her with something that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. He nodded once, then went to rejoin his team. Marin finished her coffee. She put on her coat. She walked out through the ER's side exit into the cold March morning and got into her car and sat there for a moment, engine running, heat slowly building, watching the parking lot empty as the night shift fully gave over to the day. The suspension review concluded on Friday, 4 days later. The findings were straightforward. The procedure performed by Kowalchuk M. had been consistent with the duty of care obligations under applicable Canadian healthcare standards, as they pertained to certified working animals in emergency situations. The documentation supported the DACN supported the clinical necessity of the intervention. The administrative response had not adequately accounted for the relevant regulatory framework. The suspension was rescinded. A formal note to that effect was placed in her file, which also meant the suspension itself was no longer standing there alone. Holt's position was described, in the language of institutional communications, as under review. In the language of what Marin had watched happen in the lobby on a cold Wednesday morning in March, it meant something had been set in motion that tended, in her experience, to go in one direction. She was back on shift the following Monday. Bay 3 was the same as it had always been, half-curtained, smelling of antiseptic, particular in the way that spaces become particular when things have happened in them. Fowler appeared beside her at the start of the shift with a coffee and set it on the counter without saying anything. Marin wrapped her hands around it and looked at the board. There were patients waiting. There were always patients waiting. She went to work.